see what I need to see. So, thank you all for joining us for our, I think this is our fourth session for the NASW student series. The NASW, National Association of Social Workers, and chapters from all over the country have been helping to plan these events. My name is Beryl Cohen. I'm the executive director of the Indiana chapter. I'm joined tonight by Jeremy Arp, who is the executive director of the Washington State chapter, and our handy dandy Zoom assistant and specialist is Dwayne from the Michigan chapter. He's the only one who has, I think, a Zoom room big enough for us to do this. And so hopefully between Jeremy and Dwayne and I, we can manage the questions and other things and make sure that everybody has the best experience. Our session tonight is All Social Work is Macro Social Work, learning about non-traditional social work career options and opportunities. We're talking about what things to talk about in these sessions, and one of the things that's near and dear, at least to the three of us, and to most executive directors, is the whole level of macro social work. People think of it as kind of its own little thing, but we truly believe that all social work is macro social work, because no matter where you're working and who you're working with, you have the opportunity to impact at the macro level. We are joined tonight by three speakers who are going to share their experiences at the macro level, how they'll share some with you all about how they got into macro social work. One thing you'll learn is that it's different for each of us. But one of the great things about social work as a profession and the education that you all are getting is that it is a great education that allows you to do all kinds of things with your degree. And so hopefully you will see some of those opportunities as we go through the evening. We're going to start off, like I said, we've got three panelists and I will do their introductions. So we have Nichelle Curtis-McQueen, who is an MSW. Nichelle has her BSW from the University of Indianapolis, and her MSW from Simmons University. She is originally from Indiana and has been in Washington since 2012. She currently lives in Federal Way, Washington, and is the co-chair of the City of Federal Way Diversity Commission. She currently works for the state of Washington as a juvenile rehabilitation at an institution called Green Hill School as a compliance manager, where she has worked since 2012. We also have Dr. Victor Manalo. Victor is the president of the NASW California chapter and is president-elect of the NASW Council of Chapter Presidents. He's a retired university professor and a former city councilman and mayor and local government consultant. He earned his PhD in social work from the University of Southern California and has a master's degree in social work from California State University at Long Beach. He does still teach in social welfare policy and policy practice and community organizing. He served on the Artesia City Council in Southeast Los Angeles County from 2007 to 2018. And he continues to serve as a planning commissioner for the city and is a member of the board of directors of a local nonprofit. And he's got a lot of good experience that he will share. And our final speaker, panelist, is Shannon Shell, who has her MSW and has worked in legislative advocacy for nearly 10 years, first in Arizona and now in Colorado. She has both a bachelor's and a master's in social work with an emphasis on public policy. And throughout her career, she's advocated on behalf of survivors of sexual and domestic violence, housing, funding for human services, and K-12 public education. So we have a great panel of speakers for you all tonight, and we are going to kick off with the three of them talking to you all a little bit about their experiences and how they got into macro social work and how social work has helped them at the macro level. We'll have some opportunities for some Q&A as we work through, plus we'll leave some time at the end. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat, and the three of us will be doing our best to keep up and get things answered. If you are not muted or if you become unmuted, we will likely mute you. Please, again, don't take that personally. It's just the best way for us to manage the room and the space. If we don't have time to answer your questions, we will be putting our contact information in. You are free to contact us or any of the other NASW chapters, as well as our speakers, and we'll put that information in the chat box. And I guess the final piece of my little introductory piece is that NASW is having a career fair in January. We encourage you all to check it out. Dwayne, do you have can you put the link in the chat for how to find information on that? Thank you very much. So keep an eye on the chat. Dwayne will put information in there about the January career fair. It's a great opportunity for you all to look for jobs and start doing some of that job hunting piece. And with that, unless there's some pressing question or something I missed, no, I'm okay. Everybody seems all right. No, nobody's giving me the thumbs down. So we are going to jump into the first part of our panel discussion, and each of our panelists is going to introduce themselves, tell you what they're doing now, and talk a bit about their educational path, how or why they moved into a macro level social work career, and talk some about the paths, and then we'll pick it up from there. So Nichelle, you want to kick us off for the night?
Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Like they said, my name is Nichelle Curtis-McQueen, Washington State in Federal Way, which is about 20 minutes south of Seattle in King County, or what's known as South King County. For those who are not familiar with Washington State, King County is probably the heaviest populated community in the state of Washington, and a lot of initiatives that you see at the state level often happen in King County or in the city of Seattle. Some that y'all might be familiar about is the minimum wage, $15, work around substance abuse, the reimagining public safety, all that stuff happens in my county, which it will play a role in how I got into macro social work here in just a little bit. So like also stated, I'm a state employee. I work with incarcerated juvenile offenders who have committed felony crimes and under the age of 18 and are serving a criminal sentence under a juvenile rehabilitation center or system. So these are young people that have not gone to Department of Corrections, rather stayed in the juvenile system. I was a compliance manager up until about a week ago, and I transitioned to a different job overseeing one of our larger living units, providing individual treatment for the residents within my living unit. Outside of that, I've done mental health services from a clinical lens, as well as local government work. So I studied my bachelor's in social work at University of Indianapolis, and I took kind of a hiatus and moved overseas to Germany, where I was living and traveling for a little bit before relocating back to Washington State and jumping back into the world of social work. I soon pursued my master's degree through Simmons University, which is an online program, while working full-time and doing my practicum and everything that goes with the master's program, as some of y'all might be familiar with or are going through right now, where I really learned that macro social work is my world. I learned it, I came to light to this during a policy class in my first semester of my master's program. And I was so enamored and just enlightened with the work of legislative work and impacts it has on social work practice as a whole. Through that, I learned that I don't necessarily want to do clinical work. I want to do that macro social work. And so I started putting myself in positions where I could do macro social work. The first thing I did was look at my local community at our city council and our city website, and found that there were openings for commissions through my community. I applied to be on the City of Federal Way's Diversity Commission, where I am still an active member and the co-chair of that commission. I also went to the NASW website to see if there were any opportunities for macro social work there, where I saw an opening for the National Association Washington Chapter Legislative Social Action Committee. And I applied to be a member on that committee, where I've been an active member for 5 years and now currently the chair of that committee. Lastly, The other thing I did to get myself enamored in macro social work was look at grassroots organizations within my community and opportunities to learn about macro social work as a social worker. One of the programs I did was a community leadership program, which again was a grassroots program on the local level of government, where I got to learn how to essentially do macro social work at that lower level. Though it wasn't for social workers, majority of the people in my cohort were social workers from the University of Washington, Seattle University, and other universities in the state of Washington that have schools of social work. And so that was how I found my way into macro social work, kind of accidental, but I found that I absolutely loved it. I love advocating for social workers at the Capitol because I strongly feel that I'll put it in the chat, Brandon. I just saw your question. I feel that social work gets funding by states, by state legislation and local governments, for us to be able to earn livable wages and provide the good quality treatment that our clients deserve. To answer your question, Brandon, I just went to my local city's website. So I believe in most decent sized cities, there's some kind of a city website where it has, if they have any commissions, or any groups that work with the city. These positions, oftentimes you don't have to run for public office, similar to like city council. Like in my city council runs for public office. I did an application. I was interviewed by the mayor and the city council members before being selected for this commission. Some commissions you do have to run for public office, but I have found that throughout the state of Washington, there are all kinds of commissions. I know I have colleagues that are on a commission for immigration in the city of Tacoma, because for those who don't know, there is, well, I think it's getting closed down. There's an ICE detention in Tacoma, so immigration is a huge part of that community, and they have a special commission to help support those communities in that community. That's all I have.
I'm muted. Thank you, Nichelle. Victor, you're up.
Yes, thank you, Beryl, and thanks, Nichelle. And I want to very quickly, before I forget, put in the plug for what Nichelle was talking about, that there are so many opportunities in your own backyard, and a lot. And I know that because I was an elected official in my city for almost 12 years. And there are a lot of things you could do, and you don't have to run for office. You can even work in a city. I know social workers that work in city government, and there are so many opportunities. And I think that's why this is so great. And I really appreciate Beryl and Jeremy inviting me to be a part of this, and Dwayne, because there is so much out there. The three of us couldn't even, I mean, we're going to scratch the surface on what's out there, but there's so much more that we know about that we don't have time to tell you about, that you can find out for yourself, and we'll be glad to help you with that, because there's so much to do and so much you can do with your degree. So I just want to start off with that. But my path to macro practice is kind of crazy. And it started over 30 years ago. So I'm sorry, Shannon, but I'm going to take up the rest of the time to tell everyone my story. So if you want to log off, you can log off. No, I'm just kidding. I'll give you the abridged version. But when I started, I got my bachelor's degree in social work in Marquette University. I don't know if I saw anyone from Wisconsin, but I went to Marquette University in Milwaukee. And then I moved out here to LA and got my master's degree in social work from Cal State Long Beach. And it took me a while to kind of go back to get my MSW, but I knew in the interim time between my undergraduate and graduate degree that I wanted to be a therapist. That was my main goal. I wanted to get my license. I worked in group homes. I was working a lot with children who were in the Child Protective Service system. So I wanted to be a therapist. And in my first year field placement, I was in a clinical placement. I was working in South Los Angeles. I was working with elementary school kids. I was doing groups. I was doing individual therapy, and I was in heaven. I was like, my God, I'm on my way to my license to be a therapist. I knew that was, I was like, I was on top of the world. At the end of 1991, I got married. This was right in the middle of my internship, which I would not suggest to anybody to do. Wait until after you graduate. But it all worked out because we're celebrating our 30th wedding anniversary this month. So, but anyways, so everything was going great. This is my first year in MSW internship until the spring of 1992. And I always have to tell my students or remind myself how old I am, because many students will say, oh, I wasn't even born yet, Dr. Manal, I wasn't born yet. But yeah, in 1992, in the spring of 1992 in Los Angeles, we had the Rodney King verdicts came out, and subsequently there was a rioting and uprising in the streets, not too far from where I was doing my internship. And what I took away from that experience in and of itself really just kind of knocked me on my feet, off of my feet, actually. It knocked me down, and I really kind of had to take a very hard look, because my gut was saying something like, you really want to be a therapist for the rest of your life? And as I looked outside and kind of I could look towards downtown LA, and I could see plumes of smoke rising up in the air. I saw National Guards of men and women driving around on tanks and in their Jeeps and stuff all over South Central. And it really it was a life-changing experience, obviously. And I said to myself, I don't want to be here doing 50-minute clinical sessions for the rest of my life. I want to be out there somewhere. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to be in the community, out in the community, and I didn't want to be a therapist. So then I had to do the difficult job of telling everyone, including my field instructor and people at the university, that I did not want a macro placement. I didn't want a micro placement next year. I wanted a macro placement, which I ended up doing. Eventually, though, there was right after I graduated, there was a proposition that was on the ballot that was going to cut AFDC. Now you know how old I am. AFDC, which now they call, you may know as welfare, or what do they call it? TANF, I think. I don't know. Anyways, that they were going to cut it by 20%, the benefits. And I was working in Child Protective Services at the time, and I said, God, if this happens, what's going to happen to the parents that I'm trying to reunite with their kids? What's going to happen to the kids if they get their welfare benefits cut off? And I was really angry, because this proposition was going to directly affect the work that I was doing as a social worker. So I decided I was going to learn how to try to defeat this proposition, and that was my entree into politics. And we were successful in defeating that legislation, and that was really what pointed me in the direction of getting involved in politics. Eventually led me, after we bought our first house in the city where I still live, I decided to get involved in what's happening in my own city. I was appointed to a planning commission in my city, which I subsequently found out is very important, especially if you're interested in housing. If you're interested in any kind of housing, affordable housing, planning commissions are very important, because that is the commission that makes us decisions about zoning in your cities. And that's a primary function of local government, is to zone their cities for different uses. So that was my introduction to local government. And then I decided to run for city council. It took me 3 tries. On the 3rd try, I made it, and I served for over 12 years. And it was a wonderful experience. So now I'm a recovering elected official. But I'm so now I'm still keeping in touch with all my colleagues, trying to do some consulting around public engagement with my former colleagues in local government, to try to help their residents get more engaged in what's happening in their local governments, and other issues as well. So that's it. That's as short as I can make it. So I hope. Do you have time now, Shannon? Do you have time to? Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. Thanks for sharing. Shannon, it's your turn. Not last, but clearly not least.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I don't know how to follow that, Victor. So thanks. Yeah, so as Beryl said in my introduction, I've been doing public policy and lobbying work for about 10 years now, which means primarily in my roles that I've served in, I do analysis of legislation that's being introduced. I propose new legislation. I work with legislators on making fixes or doing budget advocacy, and doing that lobbying word that everybody always treats as such a bad word. So I've been doing primarily that in the variety of roles that I've had over the years. I will say I didn't know this is what I was going to be doing when I started out. I got into social work with the intention of working in direct practice. That's all I knew social work did. And so when I went and signed up to get my BSW, that's the path I was choosing. And I have both my bachelor's and master's from Arizona State University. So I, in doing my coursework and kind of in my first year of my BSW, they sent us all off to the Capitol to go to NASW Social Work Day at the Capitol. And I just was not looking forward to this. I'm somebody who barely passed their high school government class. So I just did not think this was going to be it for me. And then I was fortunate enough to meet people who were doing work at the Capitol. And also at the time, Arizona had social workers who were serving as legislators. And that's not something I thought anyone could do. Like, that's not a conversation that had ever been had with me. I didn't think that that's like a social worker could be a state representative. That just didn't mesh with me. And so it kind of kickstarted this thought process in my head about getting more involved in what would that mean being a social worker in that role. And so I'm fortunate enough that my university provided a PAC track, a macro track, when I was getting my master's, and was able to fully focus on going down the policy road, was able to have an internship with NASW, which allowed me to be more involved in policy and get connected. And so when I graduated, I was prepared and ready to look for those types of jobs. Turns out I graduated in the recession, and so there weren't jobs. So I spent a good year plus just writing it out and waiting until eventually I did work in direct practice for a little while until I was able to find my first job doing policy analysis, and never looked back, for better or worse. I've spent a lot of time at state legislatures and at the federal Capitol doing that lobbying work, but I find it incredibly rewarding, if not sometimes challenging. What I always tell my fellow colleagues is that while I've been fortunate enough to see social workers serve as legislators, that's not the case everywhere. And social workers and the people that they're serving and the people who are the most impacted are the experts in their field. Legislators aren't always the experts in those areas. And so doing that kind of advocacy, whether it's individually or as part of your career, is incredibly important, because legislators can only know so much about so many things, and being able to communicate that is the way that we're able to make change. But that's the short of me. Most of my experience has been in Arizona, but I am a recently moved person to Colorado, so I'm still getting my bearings and getting used to the cold.
That cold would, yes, that it have an impact. Well, thank you all for sharing your introductions. My screen just went a little wacky. Hold on, give me 1 second to. The joys of trying to work on computers and everything electronic can become a bit of an issue at times. And I will admit that I am not the most Zoom experienced person. So I think the introductions that you got from these three, I hope shows all of you that there's a lot of skills that you learn through social work that help you in these pieces. I think the other key piece to think about, especially today, and is that I think we think that a lot of decisions happen federally at the national level with Congress and those kinds of things, and they have some really big picture, impacts on things. But the real difference you can make is at the local level. So at your school board level, at your city councils, or your county councils, with your commissions, those are really where a lot of those decisions get made. Yes, there's this great bill that's going to get passed. They passed all of the legislation to provide funding during the pandemic, right? But a lot of the decisions of where that money went happened at the local level. The local, the cities, the states got money, and then who makes those decisions? And so having social workers in those decision-making places can make a real difference in how that money gets invested from state to state and area to area. Jeremy, I think there are some questions in the chat.
There's a few questions. I guess the one to lead off with would be kind of one talking about internship choices, how that helped you in your path forward, but also I don't know that anyone here has a dual degree like a JD MSW, MPA MSW, MPH, MSW, PhD, whatever. But maybe talking about like the dual degree programs that you know about and whether they add value or not in your opinion, depending on your focus area. So kind of a double-edged sword there question. So
Somebody want to kick that off?
All right, this is the part that Nichelle was warning us about, because we're all like looking at each other like, oh my God, who's going to talk? Okay, but I'll go first if you don't mind. I know that to address the question about the JD, if you talk to Sarah Butts, who's the government relations person at national office, she would say yes. If you want to do the type of policy work that she's doing up on the Hill in DC, she would. I know because I've heard her suggest this. I think she did it at our panel that we had, right, Beryl?
Yeah.
She said that she suggested that we get a JD, because a lot of the people that are working in Congress and the staffers, a lot of them have law school degrees or education. Many of the electeds do, and there's a very specific type of knowledge that she thinks would be beneficial. I don't see it at any other level. I'm not sure it makes a difference in my mind. I think that even, and maybe Shannon can speak to it, and Nichelle, because they have more experience on the state level, but I haven't run across any need. I mean, I know MSWs that work for some of our state legislators here in California legislature, and they don't have JDs. They're working there just with their with their MSW degrees. And I think that the procedural stuff you can learn, even though it's not something you're going to get in your MSW program. You obviously have to learn it when you're on the ground working in that state capitol building. So I don't necessarily think it's possible. And I guess to brush on the internship thing, I think I know for me and the macro folks that I've spoken with here in California, many of us have had to kind of pave our own way in terms of internships, because there just aren't that many. Most programs, even if they do have a macro focus, don't have macro placements because and there are a lot of reasons for that. I won't go into it, but they're just not there because most programs are so primarily focused on finding the placements for the majority of students who want to do micro practice. So we've had to kind of forge our own way. But for example, next fall, I've already arranged for 2 macro field placements for 2 of my graduate students because I have connections. So I have one that's going to be, they're both going to be doing kind of legislative work, one at the state level and one in Los Angeles, in the city of Los Angeles with a city council member. So, you know, use your connections, reach out to people that you know in those spaces and inquire about possibilities of doing internship. And I think that's a good way to go.
I'll piggyback off that. I don't think having the dual JDE is necessary. In the roles that I've played, I've kind of had to learn trial by error, and just learn by my own way of how things work. It's just, you know, for my agency, it's a larger agency, putting myself on a policy committee so I can analyze policies. Even though they're just for my agency, it helps me read policies from a different lens. You know, we're making decisions that are going to impact the largest juvenile system in the state of Washington, and how, like, you know, trauma-informed care, how does clinical care direct the work that we're doing, and how do we translate that to actual policies that can hold up in courts. And so it's mostly trial by error. And really getting involved at that local level. You all have heard, you know, city councils, school boards. I think school boards are often forgotten. School boards are elected positions, and you don't have to have a child in that school district, but they make huge decisions in our communities. And then also, and I'm sure Sharon will talk about this, the state level, you know, going and hustling and bustling at the Capitol. I've learned that, you know, having the nice title's nice, but when it's an elected official and it's your elected official, they kind of need to listen to you, especially in the era of social media. And so if there's something that's important to you, that's a macro, you know, reaching out to them, getting to know your direct elected officials so that you can advocate for yourself and put yourself in those positions where you can be called on as an expert in a certain social problem issue or social problem realm.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, you know, doing policy analysis, I've been doing it without a JD and have been doing it just fine. It's a skill you learn, and you learn how to determine what some of the language is saying. And certainly there have been points in my career where I read a bill and I was like, I'm gonna need to ask an attorney. I have no idea what this legislator is trying to do with this. And so you would have relationships with people who can help suss that out. The only time that I would say really look at like a dual program is if you're really seriously considering doing the macro social work route and the school you are looking at doesn't offer a macro track or doesn't offer a lot of macro classes. Even in my macro track, there wasn't a lot of electives to take, you know, so there just wasn't a lot of macro coursework. And so I know people who have done dual specifically because of that. They wanted more options and more coursework to better prepare themselves. So that's why they looked at something like the MSW MPA or the MSW JD, just because they wanted to have a wider breadth of coursework while they were finishing up their degree.
Yeah, and to piggyback off that, Sharon mentioned that it's so important to do research on the programs. If you are really interested in macro, looking at the type of practicums they offer at a specific program, asking those questions and being very direct in those questions will help you find a program that's more conducive to macro social work if that's the area you want to go into. One of the reasons, and I forgot to say this in my introduction, I'm currently enrolled in a doctorate in social work program, but it's more of a macro social work program. And the reason I chose to do that is so that I can get that foundational background in real macro social work, because I didn't get that in my master's or my undergrad program. They're both very clinical. And I believe I've only had 2 or 3 classes of macro social work. And I want to be able to educate myself more in the public administration realm so I can pursue a higher career.
Thank you all very much. I think that the important thing to remember is there's a lot of what you learn in your undergrad and your graduate level clinical, that you use those skills, the relationship building, the making connections, the looking at systems. Those are all things that happen. I know I don't have a dual degree, but my experience working, doing direct service for a couple of years before I got into doing policy work in the mid-90s is what pushed me into doing policy work. And it's also what allows me to look at something and see what the impact would be on people. That a lawyer, I have a lawyer who lobbies with us. We have very different views on what the impact of a law is based on our experience. And so a lot of what you learn every day will help that. So don't feel like you have to do a dual degree, because that's not a requirement.
Beryl, a quick question for the panelists that's come up a couple of times about licensure and macro social work. Can you all three speak to the value of licensure for the work that you do in macro social work? Or if you're not licensed, why not? And the state laws vary from state to state. Like in Michigan, Dwayne's licensed. There's a specific macro license. In other states, it's a little bit more focused. But speaking to that, Victor, Shannon, and Nichelle.
I can go first since Victor went first last time. I am not licensed as a social worker in the state of Washington, and I don't have any plans or desires to become licensed. As I kind of stated, once I knew that macro social work was more my passion than clinical, I didn't see the need to go to the clinical route. In the state of Washington, the process of getting licensed is very, I don't want to say difficult, because it's definitely plausible, but it's a longer process than my home state of Indiana. And it can be very expensive to get that license after you graduate. And so knowing that I don't want to do clinical work in any way, shape, or the form, no diss to clinical work, I highly respect it. It's hard work, just not for me. I didn't see the cost benefit to going for my license.
Yeah, I will say the same thing. I wasn't a requirement in either state I've lived in. And for me, a lot of the jobs that I'm even seeking or have held don't list social workers as one of the preferred degrees. I'm usually having to explain why my degree makes sense in this role. And so licensure never even comes up as I'm on the job market looking for things. So for me, it doesn't, there's no added benefit for me at having a license. It would mostly just be so I could call myself a licensed social worker, and it wouldn't have any leg up in any sort of the jobs that I'm seeking. But I know that's not the same for everyone. So I think it depends.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, that's such a great point that Shannon brought up, that if you're looking for a position in macro social work, don't Google macro social work, because you're not going to find those positions. They're not people in these they're looking for policy analysts, and it might not even list the social work degree as a requirement, because people don't, in those settings, don't really understand. They understand social work as a direct practice degree, and not something that is oriented towards policy or politics or government in that sense. So you have to be able to, we've all had to do it, is to translate our skills and have to explain how we have the experience that relates to the type of work that we're doing, whether it's policy analysis, or whether it's the relationships aspect of the practice that we do in building trust and organizing and things like that. So, but I would say that, to directly to the question, Jeremy, is that I think, I don't have a license, and for the same reason that Nichelle and Shannon gave, I think if the only place I would suggest that, or the only reason I would suggest that you want to get a license, is if you want to for example, rise up in an organization or an agency that does direct service, and you want to be a supervisor and then be a manager and maybe be an executive director or CEO of an organization that provides direct service, I think then a license is appropriate and probably essential. So if that's the route you want to go, absolutely. I mean, we definitely need social workers in those high level administrative positions as well. And in that case, I would, because you're going to have to, you know, put in the time in doing the direct service before you get promoted up the ranks and get more experience at the administrative levels. But other than that, I didn't want to get my license because for all the reasons that Nichelle said, and I just didn't see myself using it in that capacity. So, I think the MSW degree, and no matter what your experience is, even if you didn't have macro experience, I think you have the skills. I think relationship building, I think is, in the macro level is of most importance, and networking is very important. So the more that you're comfortable with creating relationships with people and building relationships and kind of developing a kind of a network of professionals that are working at the macro level, that will give you opportunities and open up doors for you as well, and maybe even for people that are willing to mentor you or to provide you direction for jobs that are opening or positions that you might want to apply for.
So the afternoon, Jason got it, or?
Okay, great. And
I can take
one
both
other
of them.
question that's
Or you just
coming
want me
out.
to take him?
I think Dwayne was gonna jump in.
Oh, Jeremy's muted, so
Oh.
if he's trying to talk,
Wait.
I wanted to say real quick, because somebody was asking about titles, and just like, if you're looking at public policy, like my titles have ranged from like director of public policy, government relations director, executive director, and then things like legislative liaison, legislative affairs, public policy affairs. Like those are the kind of things that I usually search for. Currently doing that right now because I'm looking for a job. So
Yeah. And to add to that, also looking at the job duties itself to see what the actual job duties are, because sometimes the titles are, I don't want to say misleading, but they're not just as obvious. And so you got to dig a little deeper to see what will you actually be doing day to day. Are you going to be looking at policy? Are you going to be doing direct care, or is it that more overarching, like I think of like a director of something. You're over something that's much larger. You're looking at something that's a lot larger than doing direct clinical care.
I
And
think
most social workers. Oh, Beryl, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on you, but
go ahead, Dwayne, or go ahead, Victor.
most social workers don't know this, but at our state legislators, for example, in the district offices, much of what the district staff do at the state level is case management. They even call it case management. So as a social worker, you can work in a district office, and you may be assigned to work on cases that, when people call to the office and are having problems with their state level benefits, or they're having other problems that are issues at the state level, and you can help kind of guide people to the resources that they need. So, I think there are, again, a lot of opportunities, but you do have to kind of delve and go down into the job description and be able to demonstrate how the experience and the skills that you have translate to that position.
So, and I think part of the question about licensing is also dependent on where you are. And I know Dwayne can talk a little bit about the macro level licensing in Michigan. I know here in Indiana, so I can claim my MSW, but we have title protection. So I can't call myself a social worker unless I am licensed. And if I wanted to be, I'm an executive director of NASW Indiana, but if I wanted to be the executive director of an agency that does direct service, I would have to be licensed because that's how Indiana defines licensing and title protection and those kinds of things. So some of it is very dependent on where you work. And Dwayne, do you want to talk just a little bit about the macro level licensing and licensing in Michigan?
Sure. You know, we're one of the couple of states that do have a macro level license for social workers, and partially why Michigan built it out when we did is because macro social workers are often forgotten about, or like seen as like, it feels like the second tier of social workers. There's so much focus on clinical that a lot of us are like, feel disregarded. And so it was important that when we built our licensure process in the mid or early 2000s, that macro license was carved out so those folks could still be included in things like title protection. And I think I mentioned in the chat, many schools of social work require a licensed social worker to do supervision for interns. Not all of them do. So that's also where we find these shortages of macro placements, because what I tell students is every place there's a clinical social worker, there is a macro social worker, or there could be a social worker that's macro in some sort of position. So every time, you know, when you're in your field classes and you're talking about where people are placed, there could be, or there is a macro social worker in every one of those organizations, right? There are also things specifically that macro people do on the outside too that maybe aren't in some of those clinical spaces, but we are everywhere. And sometimes that title protection, because our jobs aren't titled social worker, we lose some of that identity that's tied to our MSW or BSW programs. And we also, a lot of times, macro folks lose the larger connection to the field. They don't belong to organizations like NASW. You know, there's not a lot of community support for macro professionals across the board. So the more that we can kind of have a collective voice, whether that's through organizations like NASW or why we have a license in Michigan, I think the more powerful we can be as an entity. And I know that the macro wing of our field is growing, and there's more and more interest in community activism and community organizing and political social work. And I think you're going to see that continue to grow even in our more clinical programs. So it's exciting to see. I also did just want to note, one of the resources I dropped into the chat box was a link to a Google Drive. So feel free to save that link, because in there are resources like job titles, what sort of organizations macro people are placed in, resume words, some common links for macro career searching. This was based off of, we did a couple of macro summits here in Michigan, some research things, some Twitter things that you can follow. So just make sure, I'll drop that a couple of times before we end today, but I just did want to highlight that that got dropped into the chat. So if anybody has questions specifically regarding macro licensure, I'll also make sure my contact information is in the chat box as well.
Well, and I think one of the things to remember with licensing is that every state is different. We are currently working on a compact, so a licensing compact, which will make it a little bit more consistent across the country as far as titles and things like that. There was a question about clinical work. I think as a profession and as education, the focus is on that clinical level license. But the reality is, and I think that all of us are prime examples of the fact that with that MSW, you can do a lot. The limits may be like, if I ever want to get a clinical, if I ever wanted to become a clinical social worker, I would have to go back and take those clinical classes that I didn't take, right? But I could become a licensed social worker in the state of Indiana, and it's on my list of things to do. So you have to think about what it is that you want to do. And I think really it's about being creative, because your degree and the education you have allows you to do all kinds of things. And so it's really just about what do you want to do and picking that and starting to build your expertise. So Shannon built her expertise in public policy and lobbying and that legislative wing. You know, everybody, you find your niche of what you really like. I wish I could tell you that that we could provide you with a script that says, if you do these 4 things, it'll be perfect. It doesn't quite work that way, which makes it kind of fun because you can do all kinds of things with your degree. There's a question about moving a license from one state to the next. If there wasn't a macro license, I don't know how that would translate. It would depend on the language in your legislation in your state for licensing. So if it's a comparable test in Indiana, if it's a comparable test to what we would give for the LSW, then, and you can prove it, then you could through reciprocity get your license in Indiana. But there's language and it's slightly different in every state. Again, there's a compact that we're working on that should be rolling out in 2023, I believe, or 2024. And so at that point, the language should come a little bit more consistent.
Beryl,
Go
I
ahead.
just wanted to jump in. I know that each of our panelists here have been heavily involved with NASW, and not to put them all on the spot, but maybe talking about the benefit of association membership to that macro career and the connections that you've made.
Sorry, my toddler just came home. So slamming doors. So sorry. So I obviously did my internship with NASW, which had a big connection to that. I also served on the board as the BSW. I'm looking at you, Jeremy. I don't know why I'm looking at you. You weren't my executive then, but I was either BSW or MSW rep. I served, which gave me board experience, which I found really valuable in like moving forward as I've done other terms serving on boards of nonprofits, or even when in my role as an executive director and working with my board. So I was really grateful for that experience. I will also say just the connections that I made either through NASW or through school really helped in my career. After I graduated, like I mentioned before, I graduated in the recession and I didn't really know where to start looking for jobs. Jobs were really hard to find. Even direct practice jobs were really hard to find. It was just hard to find work. And thankfully I was still in connection with my policy professor, Jeremy Arp, who found a job and sent it to me. It was like, hey, this organization's hiring a policy person. I think you might be interested. And that was the first policy job I was able to get. So like having those connections and networking really, really benefited in my career. So.
Yeah, I totally piggyback off that. When I joined the NASW Legislative Social Action Committee, I was kind of wide-eyed and bushy-tailed, and really, I loved macro work, but had no idea how to do it. And in Washington State, the LAC is what we call it, was such a small committee that it allowed me to flourish through making mistakes. And so it supported my education, it supported me learning about the legislative process, how to advocate for social workers, how to advocate for the population that I currently serve, and how to kind of talk the lingo of legislators. And someone mentioned that you'd be surprised at how many people at the state level are social workers and the experiences they bring to the state capitol. We have in Washington 3 MSWs, Jeremy? Two or three MSWs, and they all came from clinical. They didn't start in macro, and so they're able to bring that expertise to that macro level. But if it wasn't for joining the Legislative Action Committee, that was a smaller committee, I don't think I would have gone that route. I think I would have gotten overwhelmed very easy of not knowing what I'm doing. But yeah, and then getting involved at the local level, because you're able to push your NASW agenda at your local level by knowing your politicians.
Yeah, I think that, I told my students this the other day that, when I first started teaching policy, it was my goal to convert all social work students into macro social workers. And I've realized over the years that, that's just, it's not a good thing to do. It's not fair. And we obviously need social workers across all levels of practice. So, but the thing that's, I just want to make sure that everybody that on this call realizes that, that the path that, that I don't think we're asking you to just say, okay, I'm going to be macro and then try to forge your own way, because there are a lot of people that get their license, they work in an agency for a while, and all of a sudden they decide they want to do something else. They want to do something more macro oriented, or be a manager, a supervisor, or do some volunteer work at a community nonprofit as a member of the board of directors. There are so many options for you, and you can really make your own path, definitely. So, but I think that what the NASW did for me was really kind of help me make those connections to the type of work that I wanted to do in the macro arena. Because at the same time, when I told you about the same time that this proposition was being put on the ballot, at the same time, I was an NASW member, a student member, and there was a social worker who was the chair of our political action committee that I met, and he asked me to join him because it was election time, and he would take checks from the political action committee and he would deliver them to the elected officials. And I remember going with him to these visits, and we would go and we would take pictures of these elected officials, and they would say, "Thank you so much to NASW, to the political action committee for supporting me." And it started to click in my head. I was like, oh, we take our money and we donate it to certain campaigns, and they see us as friendly people, and they see us as something, as a group that supports them and are willing to support the issues that are important to them. And it really started to click in my mind. This is not something that I got in class necessarily, but I really saw it face to face. It's like, okay, here's a check. Here it is. Give it to you. Now you know who NASW is, and you know that we're going to come to you to ask you to sponsor legislation on our behalf in the future or something like that. So another things that I got to do as part of NASW is learn how, and was mentioned, how to work with other social workers, to work on committees, look at budgets, plan a conference. I got to plan a conference when I was an NASW member. So, I mean, where do you get to do that when you're working in your agency? You know, I mean, I got to plan a conference for social workers in Los Angeles when I was, I'm the president of the California chapter, but I was also honored to serve on the board of directors at the national level. So I was on the board of directors when we chose our current CEO, Dr. Angelo McLean. So I have been involved in all sorts of things in NASW. I've helped chair the Delegate Assembly, which is our policymaking body in NASW. That some of you may already be aware of this, the change that occurred in the Code of Ethics at the last Delegate Assembly. That was advanced by a member of the Washington chapter, because we as a coalition met and decided how we strategize. And we were able to kind of get that change on into the Code of Ethics about self-care. So there's so many opportunities that I got just by being a member of NASW, and so I would definitely recommend it.
So there's some questions about connecting and LinkedIn, and I won't speak for Victor, but we're close to the same age. LinkedIn was never around when I was coming up. We just kind of started meeting people and making connections. And that's one of the, I mean, for me, NASW has always been a great way to stay connected to the profession and find out what's going on. And you meet people from all over. It's a wonderful way to make those connections. If there was one piece of advice that the three of you could give to students about, like, something you wish you had known when you started, when you were working your way into it, like the one, I don't know, secret that you wish somebody had told you, or the one extra little piece of information you wish you had known before you graduated or before you jumped into the macro side of life, as advice? Anybody?
Yeah, I have some. Looking back in my academia career, I wish that my professors would have shared with me more that macro social work is a thing, that it's a real profession, and it's a thing, and to research programs that align with my career goals. I was very appreciative of my master's program, but in hindsight, I really truly wish that I would have done more research and gotten a master's in a macro social work um, arena versus the clinical. I never thought of asking, is this a clinical program or is this a more policy driven program? And they're out there, especially in this world of virtual education. Both my master's and my doctorate are online programs. And so they're out there. You just have to ask those questions. And it's nothing against clinical programs when they say, no, this is a clinical program. Are you still interested? No, thank you. I'm looking for more policy driven. I don't want to be stuck with just one class of policy and macro social work and then everything else clinical, when I know that's not my passion.
I think for me, I wish I could go back and tell myself how valuable my direct practice experience was going to be in a macro setting. I think particularly because I went to a program where there was separate, we were kind of separated and there wasn't a lot of overlap between the macro and micro side. But I will tell you, as someone who has not only had difficult conversations with legislators, but been yelled at by legislators, those direct practice skills really, I mean, that experience is invaluable to me. And so I channel back to that all the time when I'm having to have really tough conversations with people or entering a space that is going to be, quite frankly, going to be hostile. And that happens sometimes in the work. So I wish I could go back and tell myself that, because I did kind of spend time being like, oh, well, I'm probably not going to need this, because I knew I wanted to do more of the policy side. And that has ended up being a large part of the skills I bring when I come to a new organization or a new job. And it's really helped me in my career building relationships with legislators and stakeholders. So.
Victor, you muted yourself.
Yeah, thanks. I caught you before you said it. No, I was not mute. I was unmuting myself right when you noticed. I think I don't know if I would have wished that somebody had told me this, but I think from what I've learned that I think is really important for you who want to pursue something in the macro arena is, number one, follow your gut. I think that would be the one thing. I mean, if you really have a passion in your gut about wanting to do something macro, whether it's, politics or policy analysis or running for office or, community organizing, whatever, don't let the lack of support that you think is the support that's lacking there, don't let that deter you, because like I said earlier, most of us that are doing this kind of work had to forge our own way, because it's not as easy for a lot of reasons for us to do this work as it is clinical work, number one. Number two, in order to forge your way, you don't have to go at it alone. So my second thing would be, find somebody that can mentor you. That would be my other thing. If you're interested in doing stuff like Nichelle is talking about, like local government stuff, then go to your local government website, look up a bunch of people, schedule a coffee with them, and just talk to people and find out what they do, and see if it sounds interesting to you, and see it, pick their brains about the kinds of things that are done, not just in your own city or local government, but regionally. There are a lot of regional associations and groups and committees and organizations at the county level. And these are all people that live, they live and work very close to where you live and work, so they're easily accessible. And the same thing at the state level. I mean, there are people that you can contact that are more than happy to speak with you and to help direct you and provide you with resources. So that's one thing that we're trying to do here in the California chapter is just provide more opportunities like we're doing here today to show everybody that there are social workers, like Dwayne said, where there's a social worker that's doing, clinical work, there's another social worker doing macro and meso work, that we're all social workers all doing that work. And so we all need to be highlighted. So the more that we can, in venues like this, highlight those of us that are doing macro level social work, then hopefully, and this is kind of getting at a question I saw in the chat earlier, hopefully that changes, we're beginning to change social work education too, because the educational stuff will follow when there's more demand for it. And if there are more students saying we want macro social work, then believe me, the universities and the programs will follow. But they won't change what they're doing as long as most of students going into social work want to pursue a micro level degree. Unfortunately, that's the reality. But the more of us that speak up and are visible and say that we are social workers doing this type of work, the more we can show everyone that there are opportunities and that we are social workers doing that work as well.
There is a question in the chat about, do you have to be macro or micro, and is it possible to do one or the other or both? And I think I would tell you that it is possible to do both. And what I tell students here in Indiana, because of the way licensing works in Indiana, get your license, because there have been times where I took almost a 10-year hiatus out of the field because I just was kind of over it all. I wasn't licensed. I still am not licensed, but I wasn't licensed, which limited the jobs I could get. And so, to have all of your opportunities, I don't think it has to be one or the other, because it's all the same. It's just using your skills in different ways, and really finding, I think, Victor, you said it really well, it's finding your passion. What is it that you really like? I knew I didn't want to do direct service after about, I did 4 years between my bachelor's and my master's, and realized I'm not cut out to do direct service. That is just not, I don't do it well. Some people do, and some people do it really well, but still want to dabble in the macro. So anything is possible. I don't think it has to be one or the other. Although I feel like reading that question, I'm like, I think we've been talking about it as one or the other amongst us, but it's all social work. And really and truly, I think we all agree that all social work is macro social work, because when you're helping your client navigate that system, that is navigating a macro system. And that is part, and when you identify a problem and you figure out a way and can get a solution, that is macro social work. It's really not one or the other. They do fall hand in hand. So the, now I've lost track. Oh no. So I guess one last question, and it's come up a couple of times in the comments about, COVID has changed a lot for all of us. And it's impacted the way we all work. It's allowed us to use things like Zoom to get, I don't know how many people together from all over the country. It's those opportunities, but it's also impacted all of you in your education and the way that you learn. And so I guess one of the questions I would have for our three panelists as we get into our last, we've got about 18 minutes left, is how has COVID changed the macro career landscape and social justice? And do you see more opportunities, less opportunities, different opportunities? Shannon, do you want to start?
Sure. I actually been thinking about this a lot this evening as we've been having this conversation, and certainly, doing the work that I do has been incredibly challenging, like everyone else, because you're not able to interact with people. And by nature of social workers, we interact with people. That's part of what we do. And so that has certainly created unique challenges, figuring out how to do advocacy work at a capital that you can't access. I was doing this in Arizona, so, by June of 2020, everything was mostly open again. But we saw unique things where legislators used the pandemic as a way to keep people out and keep people from accessing advocacy and being part of the process rather than from a public safety lens. And so it just made the work a little bit harder. I've certainly seen growth in areas where I think there's more opportunities for people to engage, more people to get involved, more organizations have risen from this time and have created opportunities for people to be involved. But certainly, like, I know we're not trying to talk about micro and macro as being separate. They are really connected. And the one thing that I think gets lost sometimes when we talk about macro social work is that we experience burnout too. And so the pandemic was hard for a lot of us doing some of that higher level, or not higher level, but the like macro work. And I know myself, I'm taking a break. Like I've taken a step back and have been like, I need to maybe do some work and figure out what my next step is, because the last year and a half has been hard. It has been. So I think that's some of what has changed sort of in my perspective of the work that I do. But certainly, like I said, I think there are more opportunities and more like job openings, more organizations, more just tangible things are seeming to come out and be available. And I think that's really great.
Nichelle or Victor, you want to add anything in?
Yes, I will. Similar to kind of what's already been said, it was during the pandemic, and we're still in the pandemic, so much changed that one of the things that I saw in Washington, and this topic has already come up, is micro and macro social work, being separate. They're not at all. I think that you bring that lens, you bring that lived experience as a clinician to those social actions. And so, like, for instance, during full-blown shutdown, our country had to think of how we do school for communities that are impoverished. We can't assume that everyone has internet, and we can't assume that everyone has access to telehealth. And then how do we ensure that clinicians are being paid for telehealth and can bill for it? Those are social problems that needed to be addressed at that higher state and federal level. And it took social workers that are practicing clinical care to see a social problem and say, I need to advocate for myself and I need to advocate for my clients, which, that's what we do. And so to see those changes in Washington, our agenda items changed. Last year was my first year chairing the legislative committee and planning a policy conference, and then planning it virtually. So add like planning it, and then also now we're doing it virtually. How do we ensure that things that are important to social workers get pushed through legislation session, knowing the dynamics of legislation session and the top priorities around COVID and around access to mental health and police reform at the time. And then, as people said, burnout is absolutely real. You have to have courageous conversations and advocate for things that sometimes people don't believe in because they don't have that lived experience with that population or with that social problem. And so a lot of people I see take a step back and maybe might go back to that the clinical side of their work, or leave the whole practice altogether for a little bit. And that's okay. Social work is really hard. If it were easy, everyone would do it and everyone would understand it, but here we are. So yeah, that's how I saw the changes in the last year.
For me, actually, I think that the pandemic with the shutdown and the limited availability to meet people face to face. Of course, I really didn't like it for the first 6 months or so. But I'm telling you that, I became president of the chapter in the midst of this pandemic, and I still have to, be able to be engaged and involved with board members. So I've really kind of taken the opportunity to reach out to people using Zoom. I mean, I know a lot of people are suffering from Zoom fatigue, But what I've been doing lately over the last few months is I've been connecting with social workers on LinkedIn. And if because I'm recruiting macro level social workers for a conference that we're doing in May. So what I've been doing, if I come across somebody on my LinkedIn that's a macro level social worker and identifies that way on their LinkedIn, I connect with them and I message them and I say, hey, do you want to chat about, what you're doing in macro social work? And I've connected with a lot of folks a lot of social workers over the last year and a half or so. And it's been great because I've gotten to meet social workers even here in Los Angeles, not too far from where I live. I just met a CEO of a great agency that provides recuperative care to people who are unsheltered. So if they are unsheltered and they go in the hospital for a major operation or procedure, if they're unsheltered, they have no place to recuperate. So this agency is paid for by insurance companies and funded by insurance companies, and homeless folks can go recuperate in this facility, and then they can receive other supportive services to make sure that that they are no longer living on the streets after they recuperate. So I met her a few weeks ago, and I've met a lot of people that way, and I love being able to expand my network in that way and to use Zoom to do that and other meeting video chatting. I've met with more people in legislative offices over Zoom over the last year than I've ever met face to face. So I think, here in California, a lot of legislative offices are taking advantage of the opportunity that since everyone is working from home, a lot of people are still working from home, even legislative staff. It's easy for them to just get on a Zoom, throw something official looking in the background, and meet with constituents. So I think there's the opportunities are different, but I think they're much better now because then I don't have to drive to Sacramento, which is like 8 hours from me. I can just get on a Zoom, and it's I think there's a lot of opportunity for us, like we have in direct practice with telehealth. I think we could do that in other areas as well.
Thank you all. I guess we've got about 6-7 minutes left. I think, Jeremy, we caught the majority of the questions.
I think so. I think, just one quick mention, because I'd be remiss if I didn't always plug NASW events, but one thing that's great, not great, but one opportunity with COVID and with everyone doing their events virtually and having these free platforms is that you could live in one state and attend an event in another state. So many thanks to Dwayne and Beryl for helping to organize this event here, hosted by the Michigan chapter, right? And Beryl in Indiana and myself in Washington. We're able to work across state lines with Shannon in Colorado, Victor in California, and Nichelle up the road from me. So I think it's really cool that we can do these things. So I'd encourage everyone to check out the NASW chapter in your state. But if you see something cool going on in Michigan or Washington or Indiana, feel free to hit us up to attend our legislative days, especially if they're free. We'd love to see you there. That's another way to get macro exposure too.
And I think that one of the things I would like you all to think about is owning your degree and owning your knowledge. As social workers, we tend to think about that we fix people, we help people, right? We do that at all levels. And I think it's really important to think about how you can use those skills and how you can own your degree. I've always, no matter where I've been, and I've met with economists, I've met with all kinds of people, and I always am very clear about that. I have an NSW and I am a social worker, and that is my background. And so that they realize what we know. We are an amazing profession with all kinds of skills and experience and knowledge, and we really need to own that and claim it and make sure that we acknowledge it when we meet with people and don't, Sarah Budd says this sometimes, that she'll be in a room with all these lawyers and they'll have discussions and she'll say something and somebody will be like, you're not a lawyer. We have different perspectives, and I think it's really important that we share that because we see things from in a different way than other people do. And so to really own that and be proud of it, and not think about it as, micro versus macro or any of those other things. There are we have 55 NASW chapters all over. We have a lot of really great resources. If you're not a member, we hope that you all will consider joining. We have, I put in the chat, we did, Victor mentioned it earlier, we did a panel on the essential social workers, the essential roles of social workers, something like that. And it's a recording on our YouTube channel. We have 4 sessions from our conferences here up on our YouTube channel that you can watch and find out about other things that you can do as a social worker. It is, and I don't just say that because I am one, but I think we really have a lot of really good, we bring a lot of value added to almost anything that we do, if not everything that we do. And so please be proud of your degrees and claim them and use them to do amazing things, because whether you do direct service, you do macro, you do a little bit of both, you can have a huge impact on people's lives every day, and you do. And so please just make sure that you remember that. So with 4 minutes, Victor, Nichelle, Shannon, you have any last thoughts? Dwayne, Jeremy, any last thoughts? I'll put our YouTube channel in one more time in case anybody's interested.
I just want to say there are more macro social workers out there than you think there are. So if you are a macro student or you're a macro professional and you are feeling like you're the only one, which feels like that a lot of the time, right? Know that you are not alone, and there's a big community of folks out there who want to support you and that are here to support you in whatever you need. Partially, that's why we wanted to have this conversation too, because so many of, especially macro students, feel so out of place in their programs. But know that there are a lot of students and professionals who got your back and who are here and ready to welcome you into the field.
And there is one question in the chat about additional tips for new MSW macro recent graduates when getting ready to look into job postings and opportunities. I would tell you, if you see something that you're interested in, sell your skills. There really isn't much of anything that, okay, so maybe you can't go be a lawyer and you can't go be a doctor, but there's, I ran projects, I worked for the state of Indiana and ran all the state's poverty programs. You can do all kinds of things. So don't feel like you have to fit into a box of clinical, or if you've done clinical that you have to stay there. You can do anything with your degrees. And Nichelle, I saw you unmuted, so I will let you have the last words.
Yes, and I will add, for new professionals coming right out of school, I can say this for myself. I started as an on-call security officer as a bachelor's in social worker, and I've been able to navigate my career to where I am today. And a lot of the stuff I've done has been outside of my professional job. I always say 90% of my coworkers have no idea what I do outside of work. And so I sought out opportunities of macro social work outside of my career profession. And I think those are things that we just have to remember. If you decide to venture down this road of macro social work and clinical social work, that it might not be at your place of employment. It might be like Dr. Victor at his local level, city level, or even at the state level, working at the Capitol, but you might start off volunteering, as what I mean to say, and networking and creating those avenues to get that foundation and get into that world of macro and advocating for yourself and clients that you work with.
Yeah, Beryl, if I could just add, I just want to reiterate again, it's just to, follow your gut and then just, keep your eyes open for those opportunities. Because sometimes you don't know what opportunity is going to take you down the path that you should be going down. And sometimes we're not sure and how it might apply. When I first got on the planning commission, I didn't know what I was doing, but the first issue that came up before my planning commission was about approving a medical home for people who are being discharged from the hospital that wanted to rehabilitate in a home-like setting. And it was a medical facility. And when I was an undergraduate student, I did an internship at a rehab hospital. So I knew the population they were talking about. And when this came up on my planning commission, I was like, oh my God, now I know why I'm here. Like I can, as a social worker, I can actually make a contribution to this and talk about my understanding of those patients and the need to rehabilitate and so on and so forth. So it was really it really was an acknowledgement for me that I was going in the right direction. So follow your gut, go look for those opportunities, find somebody to help you along the way and point you in the right direction and provide you with suggestions and feedback.
And I think that will be the last word, Victor. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. Dwayne has tossed in the chat a few times about where the recording, so this is recorded, you can view it again. And there's a ton of other stuff. I would assume that you all know now how to save chats so that you grabbed all of that stuff that you needed. I believe if you hit the 3 dots on by where you type, you can go in and save the chat that way so that you have the chat. And again, check all of our websites. You can go to social workers with an S at the end, .org is the national website, and you can connect to any chapter from that website. So thank you all for joining us and for your questions and participating and listening. Thank you, Victor, Nichelle, and Shannon for sharing your expertise. Dwayne, thanks for staffing so wonderfully the Zoom and setting all of this up for us. Jeremy, as always. I love doing stuff with these guys. We are our own best cheerleaders, so please remember to cheerlead for yourself and support yourself because it's important, and the work that you do every day is amazing. So thank you all for all that you do. Good luck as you finish up your schooling, and be in touch if you need something.
Thanks, everyone.